I'd like to add my welcome to everyone who's listening in today. My name is Eric Ritchie. I'm a senior technical consultant at Zend. Today we're going to be talking about Zend Studio with regards to performance. Quite a number of people have been talking to, of course, representatives of Zend whenever we've been at conferences, and a recurring theme is that the performance of Zend Studio is critical, or at least an issue for most people, and especially in the days since we've moved to using Eclipse as a basis for our studio product. Of course, the reason for that is that huge amounts of functionality have been built into Studio. It's a much greater product than it used to be when we developed our own completely independent IDE, and because of that, because of those extra features, effectively your machine has to work a little bit harder, and that can be prevented, of course, if you structure your projects properly. So this is what we're going to be talking about today, at least in part. As you can see, this is actually part one of this particular webinar. So this is the first hour we're going to be covering today, and we'll be going into more details next time. So if you see something or talk about something and you think, Eric didn't really talk about that in great depth, reason probably is that we'll be covering that next time. What you're going to be seeing today mostly is how not to do things. I'm going to be looking at the problems that most people, or the traps that most people fall into, purely for convenience sake mostly. You think this is a nice easy way to define a project, and of course it is, but unfortunately that usually has a performance penalty. So let's get started and see how far we get. My machine actually crashed quite hard before I came online today, so hopefully everything is up and running. Might have some sticky issues with switching, but hopefully not. So let's see how far we get. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today, as I said, is Studio, but more particularly we're going to be talking about Studio 8. This is of course our latest version of the Zend Studio product. Of course, you might be thinking, well, what about me? I'm running Zend Studio 6 or Zend Studio 7. If you're that person that is still running an old version, then it's advisable to think about updating. Zend Studio 8 is based upon the latest Eclipse Helios platform, and that platform itself brings multiple performance benefits. In actual fact, Zend Studio 8 tends to outperform Zend Studio 7 by quite a degree without making any changes whatsoever. And that's not because of any particular change in operating system or any particular change in Java version. That's only because the Helios project seriously improved the way that Eclipse does its housekeeping, and therefore, because Studio is based upon that, Zend automatically, and of course you, get the benefits of that upgrade. So strictly speaking, if you're still using Studio 7, especially if you've purchased Studio 7 in the last year, you can apply for a free update. Get that update, it's very valuable. But we aren't going to be talking about our tricks. So everything that you see here you should be able to do out of the box. You won't need any particular administrative rights on your machine. You won't be customizing the installed version of Java. You won't be digging in the registry if you're a Windows user to try and short-circuit some functionality. You won't be making any networking changes. What you're going to be doing is just restructuring your project in such a way that that Studio doesn't have to work so hard to bring you the features that it's trying to bring you. Because in general, it's actually Studio trying to please you that actually shoots itself in the foot half the time, which is a bit sad, but that's what we're going to be trying to get to the end of today. And of course, we won't be turning off all the nice features of Studio 8. You can do quite a lot of customization to Studio itself, such that you can turn off, or at least the displaying of code completion, you can turn off validation, and a lot of the other features. But of course, if you're going to do that, then you may as well go back to VI or WordPad, because basically you're then not going to be getting the full value out of Studio. So we're not going to be insulting you after purchasing your license by saying, well, yes, performance was great if you just turn off all these nice features. That's not what we're going to be doing today. What we're going to be trying to do is to master our IDE. Basically, the main reason for that is that usually you have, as a developer, your IDE in front of you 8 or more hours of the day, usually 8 as a minimum. If you work in a really nice company that estimates projects correctly, then you probably will only be working 8 hours a day, but I think everybody on the line here, and myself included, has been in the situation where usually that ends up being 12 hours a day on some occasions. And the last thing you want in such a circumstance is your IDE to be getting in your way and effectively be delaying you further. So what we want to do is try and grab a hold of the bull by the horns and effectively bend it to our will. Unfortunately enough, that's not really terribly hard to do. It's just that you need to know how to do it, hence the reason why I'm here today. The configuration of Studio, if you've ever actually clicked into it, it can be quite foreboding. It's got a lot in there that you can actually change, and at first glance it looks incredibly complicated. And you might think, oh, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to master this. No problem. Actually, I come from a system administration background. I do a reasonable amount, or I did a reasonable amount of coding until I got into the business of chatting to people as a consultant. But I've never really cared too much about my IDE. I always just started it and used it. And so I'm basically the type of person who doesn't want to read into the details of the manual and effectively work out what's going on. So if I can do this, then basically anybody can. So that's the main thing about this particular course, this particular webinar, is we're not going to be doing anything really complicated. What we're doing should make sense, technically speaking, and should be easy to achieve. And that's effectively what I'm going to be trying to do today. The phrase master your IDE, it's not actually spawned by yours truly. It was actually first uttered by this man here, and this man is actually Roy Gaynor. He is the Eclipse project manager at Zend, and he gave, well, probably not this exact presentation at ZenCon this year, but he definitely gave something similar to it, because he, of course, is the project manager of the Eclipse project, is the person who ends up with all the customer complaints about Eclipse being slow. And so he tried to put together a presentation, which you're going to be seeing, of course, distilled components of, to explain that at ZenCon. So basically, he's the guy that started this whole thing off, and I'm the one that's going to be showing it to you today. The line and subtext here, because 8,000 lines of code is more than enough. I don't know if that means per file. That's one of the first performance issues that a lot of people run into, is that if you have very, very long files in Eclipse, then it starts to get quite slow. And so usually you're wanting to keep your files short. But I'm not going to go into great detail about that today, because there are other ways, without changing your source code, that we can squeeze quite a bit of performance out of Studio. The basically, why is Studio slow? Well, there are actually one or two reasons. I'm not counting here the problem of the machine that it's running on, but of course it could be that your machine is just short of memory. Then for Eclipse, that's quite a serious problem. And I've got 2 gigabytes in this machine in front of me, and I still have issues with memory at times, just because I tend to be lazy and never shut things down. But that's not usually the main reason. The main reason is this. Now, I don't know if you've come across this as you've been using Studio, but usually when you start Studio the first time or you open a project, then you're going to see something like this taking place. And because, as you can see here, there are more than 2 tasks which are running simultaneously, and Studio only really allows 2 tasks to go on at the same time. That means that while this process is running, you can't do any work, or at least you can sort of do work. You can open files and you can start typing, but you can't save anything. And if you're like me, the type of developer that likes to save often and check even more often, then this is really frustrating, because you get about 30 seconds into your day's work and then you have to pause because effectively these processes are running for forever. Basically, what these things are actually doing for you, they're not bad things. In actual fact, they're very, very useful things. So for a start, the build project is trying to assemble the functions within your project, which it will then present to you via code completion. So without that particular step, you would have to remember the names of all your functions by heart, which for some people would be no problem, but for me it would be terrible, because my memory is absolutely abysmal, and I can't really live these days without code completion, which is why, despite the fact I love VI, I don't use it for developing PHP code anymore. But by far the worst time consumer is this DTLK indexing process, and it's not entirely clear from the acronym what that actually is, and what it actually stands for is Dynamic Languages Toolkit. It's not something which was actually produced by Zend, so we get a lot of blame for this, but it's not actually us. It's actually a standard Eclipse project, and what it does is it effectively parses scripting languages, and effectively builds an index of that scripting language within memory, allowing you to effectively analyze and provide code completion. Of course, it's been used by Zend because it's developed by quite a consortium of different people. It effectively provides support for quite a number of scripting languages. PHP is just one of them. And of course, in using that, whenever a new version of Eclipse comes along, it's updated. So it's not something that Zend has to do any work to maintain, but of course it's there, and it's not something we can influence. Again, not really a bad thing, as we'll see later on. Without it, Studio would be a much weaker product. So we're definitely happy that it's there, but it's something which will seriously slow down your machine as you start Studio if you've got large projects, and we'll see that later on. The final part of the puzzle is validation. We all know that, of course, there are more than one different types of file in a web project. We've got, of course, PHP files, we've got HTML files, we've got CSS, XML, Vistal files. The list is endless. In actual fact, Eclipse, as standard, supports the analyzing of quite a large number of these different file types, including all sorts of JavaScript libraries, and well, as I said, the list is kind of long and not really worth mentioning here in its entirety, because I don't want to put you to sleep any more than I'm going to, of course. But without it, of course, it could be that you have typos in your scripts and you don't see that, and then only through bug reports when you actually deploy code do you see problems. But if you're validating in your source, then you can see it as you're typing it. This is quite a major feature and an advantage, but again, it's something which needs to be done to every single file in your project. And some of those files, especially XML files, can be incredibly large and will take quite a long time. So what we're wanting to do is effectively keep all of this nice functionality, but effectively reduce the impact that this build process has while we're working. So just a definition of DTLK, Dynamic Languages Toolkit. As I mentioned, it's basically not something that's provided by Zend themselves, but it's provided by the nice people that are members of the Eclipse project. And down in the bottom right corner of the screen here, you'll see the URL, which is that project link. So if you're interested in what it's actually doing, then you can go along and find out. But it's beyond the scope of this particular webinar, so I'm not going to spend very much time actually discussing it, or certainly no more than I already have done. So without further ado, let's take a little bit of an example. This is not an example that we're going to actually look at in a web browser, but it's a block of code that I'm going to be using. Actually, I stole from one of my colleagues. As like I said, I'm a bit of a lazy guy. So I stole that piece of code. It's not my own, but it is quite a nice example of exactly what you could be dealing with in your actual day-to-day. So in this particular case, this example application is a split between front end and back end. We'll see the back end in a second once I click further. And what the front end is allowing the user to do is effectively upload images or image files to the cloud. So Amazon, quite a large number of different things. But because we don't want to actually have the user wait for the upload process, because of course we could be needing to convert those images. In fact, it's a good idea for security purposes to effectively resize, especially JPEG images, to make sure that they are actually JPEGs and we haven't been fed something that that contains some dodgy information in it. So basically we're wanting to resize. That could take some time. We don't want the user to wait. So what we have is we have a backend to our application, which effectively leverages the job queue of Zend Server. That's the last piece of marketing that I'm going to be introducing in today's webinar, by the way. So there we have a job which takes the uploaded image and then effectively applies a number of steps to it. So effectively resizing that image, uploading to Picasa or to Flickr or whichever particular image store that you're wanting to be using, maybe uploading to Amazon. The list is endless. It could be that you're uploading to quite a large number of sources. And of course, anything that's using XML RPC is going to be tremendously slow, or it's certainly not going to be blazingly fast. So it's not something that you're really wanting the user to wait around for. So we have this front-end, back-end architecture so the user can literally just drop a file onto the system, get a thank you message, maybe get a link that they can effectively use that to check up upon their image from time to time. It could be that we're offloading the resizing or the conversion of our image until off hours so that the web server is not unduly loaded. And therefore the user might want to come back and check upon the files that he's uploaded to see that they are actually available before he tells his friends about them. And then the back end running, like I say, potentially not at real time, will do the work of uploading everything. So we've got effectively split architecture. In this particular case, our split architecture is using Zend Framework both in the front end and in the back end. So if we're assuming that this is running with two document routes here, i.e. two separate virtual hosts, then we need to effectively, or potentially could have two copies of Zend Framework in play. And this particular application also leverages the IDE components library, which is available through Pair. That was programmed by Sebastian Bergman for his diploma thesis, and it's actually used by quite a number of people these days. It's a good way of creating a workflow within your application. Again, beyond the scope of this particular webinar to go into that in more details, but basically it's something that you might want to look into. So as you can see, we've got quite a large number of libraries in play. It could be that we're also using other libraries for doing our uploads. That's in all probability a Zend Framework which is being used there, but it could be anything. So large amounts of code, in actual fact. This would be our structure effectively within our web server. I actually have this structure on my local machine here within a virtual machine. And as you can see here, this is Linux format, so var www.iwf. And then we have a front-end subdirectory, back-end subdirectory, and within that front-end and back-end we've got custom code. Of course, we will need to have some functionality that we programmed ourselves. But we also got our own copy of Zend Framework. A lot of people tend to do that. They tend to embed Zend Framework into the project for the reasons of maintainability, I suppose, because they like to tie one particular project to a specific version of Zend Framework, just in case later versions tend to break functionality, or at least allowing them to check through QA if a new version is going to work with their custom code. And of course in the back end we've got Zend GData and Easy Components as well to deal with. And the question at the bottom here is everything in version control. Of course it's a very good idea to work with version control systems because especially when you've got large amounts of developers in your team, it's always nice to find out who's done what. But generally a lot of people certainly tend to throw all libraries into version control as well, which is, technically speaking, not really a problem, but of course just adds bulk to the repository, and I don't know about you, but it's certainly not a good idea to make changes to libraries that you're leveraging, because you never know when those libraries are going to change their API or their internal structure. So generally what you're best to do is to extend them somehow. But then you wouldn't be actually maintaining the library code itself. You would be maintaining your own custom code. So just put your own custom code into version control and then rely on the Zend development team or Zend Framework development team's source code control to maintain that project, and then everything will work out a little bit better. The reason for that really is that if you throw everything into your version control, then you tend to end up with one big blob of code. And it's very tempting to just throw that code at the web server just with one single checkout. And of course, it's also very convenient to effectively just include that big amorphous blob of code as one single project in Zend Studio. And as we'll see later, that has some rather nasty side effects. So to give a little bit more detail, of course I'm not going to show the actual source code itself of our demo application. Demo in that it's effectively just a logical entity that we're analyzing within this webinar. Using PHP lock, it produces a listing of the lines of code of your application. This is another tool that Sebastian Bergman has programmed. He's of course a relatively busy man, produces quite a lot of nice utilities. So this one here we're using to effectively run over the entire project here. Now this is the front end and the back end and all the libraries together. And as you can see here, we get quite a lot of information, especially the things like the number of namespaces which are used, interfaces, classes, etc., etc. But effectively, the thing that we're most interested in is, in actual fact, these four figures here, which came from this part of the slide here. These are effectively the total number of lines of code in our project, the number of comment lines, and the number of non-comment lines of code. So this is effectively the number of lines of code within our project that our interpreter has to run through in order to effectively execute our project. Now, that's a reasonable number of lines of code. It's something that it could be that has just grown through years of development, but it's more likely these days, especially with the popularity or the gain in popularity of frameworks, that the majority of those lines of code come from some sort of framework, whether that be Zend framework or Symfony or PHP. There are more PHP frameworks these days than my poor memory can deal with. And so it's quite likely that, and in actual fact, in our project, as we'll see in the coming slide, that 1.2 million lines of code are very few of them actually relate to us. So that's something that we really don't want to have Zend Studio worrying about the majority of those lines of code, because we didn't write them and we don't really care about them, apart from the fact that we're using them or we're using the functionality, but normally we're using that functionality as a black box. And so we're interested in the black box, not the details within it. So why should we have Studio run over those lines of code if we don't care about them so much? Just to give you some numbers as to the effective lines of code that we have in our custom code in this particular application. In the front end, we've effectively got 223 lines of code. In the extension in the front end to the ZX components, we've got another 223, and likewise in the back end, we've got relatively small numbers of custom lines of code. So as you can see, there's less than 1,000 lines of code that we actually have written. Of course, this is a relatively simple example. It's unlikely that you as in the audience are going to have a project with this small lines of code, but it's just for emphasis purposes. The complete project, as we saw on the previous slide, has got just a nose under 700,000 lines of code, so we're talking about 1 to 700 in the neighborhood of a ratio between our code to library code. Now, as I mentioned, the easy way is to take the pragmatic approach, or when adding this code to a Zend Studio project, is to effectively take it and just throw it into one big project. Worse than that, or let's not say worse than that, because a lot of people tend to work that way, and I don't want to be overly critical, or at least not seem to be here, is that it's very tempting, if you've got a small number of developers certainly, to have one development server which is somewhere in the server room. It could even be in a hosting center somewhere, and effectively host the software there, and then have the developers effectively access that code remotely and make changes on the actual development server. That was fine in the days of Zend Studio 5.5, because there was very little work going on to actually parse through that huge amount of code. But these days, that's no longer the case. Zend Studio 8 actually does a fair amount of work to essentially work out what your code is trying to do and hint as to how you could continue to develop that by code hints, etc. But let's see just how we would naively add a large block of code to our studio. So here is in fact a Zend Studio that I happen to have lying around. I've got quite a number of projects here already, and one of these was actually causing me problems earlier because I think it got corrupted. But so basically what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to effectively add a new project. There are a variety of ways that we can do that, but new PHP project is probably the easiest way. Give our project a name. We can either effectively have a new project created, which is the default option, and then copy files into it. That's usually the way that you would go if you're starting off a project, but here I'm a new developer, I've just joined a company, and I know that I've got a block of source code somewhere on a server, and so what I want to do is effectively create a project at an existing location. And if I click Browse, I can then browse for that location. That could very well be that, as I have here, I've got a Samba server, and that's where my code resides. So here I'm now selecting my X drive. It won't let me actually create this project because I already have a project in Studio which is using this path, but fair enough. I can then create that project, and Studio will then go off and try and work out what is at that location. The thing about that is that's going to take a little bit of time. Let me just cancel this and go back to our slides. I would suggest that you don't do that. Maybe I'm being a little bit arrogant, but really I'm not. I'm trying to be as helpful as I can. Maybe I sound like a know-it-all. But if you're actually developing this way, especially over network shares, then that's the main reason why you're having performance problems with Studio. There are, of course, other reasons, and we can still get other benefits, but the main thing comes from the fact that Zend Studio is not really designed to work with remote projects. And if you do use it with remote projects, of course, there are a huge number of features in Studio, and yes, you can work remotely. There's nothing to stop you, but it is going to cause you problems. Of course, back in the 5.5 days, as I mentioned, it wasn't doing that much analysis, so it was no real problem. So that's the first tip of the day. Don't use remote projects if you can help it, and usually you can. And I'll show you various ways that you can actually work around the requirement for remote projects. So going back to poor unfortunates who are using remote projects, there are of course two different ways of accessing files remotely. You can effectively use SSH. So again, from my virtual machine, or again using my virtual machine, I could effectively go to my remote project explorer, or my remote system explorer, and here is effectively a representation of my virtual machine. I hopefully have already got a connection to that server. And there we go. So basically these are the files in my virtual machine. So effectively I can navigate into that virtual machine, and then I can effectively see at this point, right, I want to add this component to my project. And then it would of course be added to the active project, which is in Studio. The problem with that is that this is effectively going to create a link, which is virtually immediate. If I click this, then it will immediately return me control because very little is going on. The problem is that that's very quick to do. But then after that, whenever I want to work with my project, I'm then working remotely. So basically, I'm connecting across my SSH to my remote server every time I want to effectively save a file or load a file. But worse, when Studio actually goes through and analyzes every single file, I have to effectively transfer the entire project over SSH every time that happens. And that, of course, is painful. A better way is to import this path to my project. Then I have to pay in one time, because effectively everything gets copied from my server to my local machine into my workspace. But then, of course, I'm working locally. Probably about the worst thing that you can do is actually create a remote project, because what that does is it not only keeps the files remote, but also all of Studio's helper files, all the resource files, those which start with a dot in your workspace, they're also stored on the remote system. And the disadvantage of that is even when Studio has to open its project, it has to go and refer to the remote system. So effectively, worst of all worlds. So obviously enough, I'm not going to do that in this particular case. What I'm going to do is go back to my slides and continue talking. Now, of course, we've done benchmarks. This was done with a virtual machine on a local system. So when we were accessing the project, this is a complete project via SSH, then a clean, and by a clean that means that effectively you've gone in and you've caused the project to completely rebuild. And of course there's a number of reasons why you'd want to do that, but mostly it's because something has got corrupt. Maybe someone's put files into the system that you are wanting to get access to now. But there are a variety of reasons, but the upshot is that we're wanting to run a complete run-through. That takes 41 minutes with SSH, and I think you could brew quite a cup of tea in that time. With Samba, it's not so bad. It's 5.5 minutes. It's in the neighborhood of okay. That's still a good cup of tea, and it's not something you'd want to do often. The reason why that's actually so fast is it's artificially fast, because that Samba share was actually local to the machine that was running the test, so that you weren't actually going across the network at all. It was just virtual networking within the machine. So, but even though that was virtual networking, you still get a 2-minute benefit from using local files. There are other ways that you can actually rearrange your project in order to get even more benefit, or to work locally, if you still want to have a shared development environment. That's to use VMware. Here is in actual fact a VMware image, and this is the one that I was using to get access to provide me a Samba share and also SSH. And a little known feature of, I say little known, it's actually a relatively well hidden feature of VMware, is that you can effectively mount components of the local hard disk. If you go into the settings of this virtual machine, okay, and then click on the option tabs, there's a shared folders option, and then you can bind effectively local files, components of the file system of the host into the virtual machine. And what that allows you to do is effectively have your perhaps your SVN checkout files on your local hard disk, allowing Studio to work locally, but still have a virtual machine which has your development environment in it, accessing those same files. The benefit there is that it sounds like a very roundabout sort of way to work, but the benefit is that if you've got a development team of maybe 10, then you create this virtual machine one time. So long as everybody stores their files in the same place, then you can effectively take this virtual machine, copy it 10 times, and everybody can work, no problem. And And the performance of this is actually very good. I use this exact method to develop on this machine that I'm running from at the moment, and I actually see very little difference than having a local development environment. I actually switched from using a local development environment because it was crashing all the time, and so I wanted to have the stability of Linux blocks. So this way I found to actually provide me local access to the files, and it works out great. In actual fact, it's quite a nice thing. And the other way to effectively use local files is using a feature of Zend Studio. This is not the Remote System Explorer. Getting back to my slides, of course. This is actually something which was added as of, I think later versions of Studio 7 had it as well. I think it came in around about Studio 7.1.2. I think that's when I first came across it. But it's possible to effectively copy the files from the remote server and then sync them back whenever you make changes. So let's have a quick look at that. That's the wrong machine. Okay. So there are two ways that we can actually set this up. The first is that we can effectively select New and then PHP Project from Remote Server. So we again want to supply a project name. In this case, I'm just going to go with test. And in this particular case, I just want to create the project in a workspace. That's fine, doesn't really matter. You can also use, if you've already got a copy of the source from the server, you can of course create your project at an existing location. That works too. But the main thing is that we're wanting to actually set up the remote connection. So here we're wanting to either select or previously, this is the SSH connection that we saw previously. So I'm actually going to use that. The project directory, we have to tell Studio where to find the files within the document tree that you saw me browsing through earlier. In actual fact, I'm interested in the complete project in this particular case. So that's in var www and IWF in actual fact. So then I should be able to select next. It's probably going to now go off and copy this. I hope not, because I don't want to take all day doing this. Okay. Let me just explain what it's doing and why I didn't really want that to happen at the moment. Is it's effectively analyzing the remote system. Okay, it's now provided me with a list of things. And what I can now do at this point is specify which components of my project I want to actually download to my local machine. If you do this, of course, it will take a little bit of time. But then after that, you can work quite happily. Let's just uncheck some of these. Let's actually just take that and finish, and hopefully that will be relatively quick. Okay, I don't know why I'm having to... Okay. So it's created a project for me. If I have a look at the console, I should now be able to create a new file here. Of course, I haven't actually copied anything to my machine at this point, but that's okay. I want to create a new PHP file, which I should be able to do. Call this test and finish. And it goes and whirs and clicks for a little while. Okay, and then test, I don't know. Okay, it isn't synchronizing automatically. So let me just set that up. I must have missed the option. The other way that you can actually bind a project to a remote server is that you effectively go into the project properties. And I don't see it. Why don't I see this? Properties. Okay, this is not working for me. I don't know why. properties are very, okay, that's different. Okay, then the reason for that, let me just delete this project for the moment, rather than trying to work out how to fix it. And let me try and just bind this particular project to the remote repository. This should also be local. You see that it's on my D drive, but I have the option to go to remote server support and effectively do the same thing that I did before. And then in this particular case it's IWF and IWF front end. And then I can specify how I want to update my files. On save is actually the one I want to use, because effectively any changes I want to... Okay, that's nice. I want to effectively change the file so that I want to save. I want them to be uploaded to the server automatically. And yes, demonstration effect, that fails. But hopefully it still is fine. Let's just see what I've actually done here. Okay, the remote connection didn't work. Okay, maybe it's because I've got the wrong path. Oh, dearie me. IWF backend, IWF frontend. As far as I can see, the paths do exist. Okay, so it's a little unlucky. IWF frontend should be the same, but it isn't working for me. Why? Okay, that's unfortunate. Hopefully I'll get that working for the next webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time. Let's continue. Basically, the next tip that you can have is to split your project up. Of course, working locally is the biggest thing that you can do, but actually what you can also do, and unfortunately I'm probably not going to be able to demonstrate it because of the technical problem that I'm having, but fortunately I got there previously, is that you can take your project and actually split it up into various studio projects, because it really doesn't make sense to have Zend framework within your main project, because you're never going to be modifying that code, so why have Zend Studio parse it? Much easier to have it in a separate project and then link those projects together so that you then effectively have one master project, which is your custom code in it and refers to the library project. So let's have a quick look at that. So here, as you can see, we only have our custom code. If we take a look at the properties of that project, we'll see that we have, okay, where is it? Project references. We have reference to Zend Framework 1.1.1 in here, and so effectively that's why we have Zend Framework 1.11.1 in our include path, or subprojects effectively. We actually had a look at our backend project, which I just have to open now. We'll see that we've got a lot more. No, I wanted to open it, sorry. We'll see that we have a lot more in the way of linkages, because as we saw in our slides, we have easy components in the back end and GData and all sorts of good stuff. So basically here our include path is a lot more complex. And we can effectively here specify that when this project is opened, we want to have these sub-projects opened with it. Of course, these sub-projects are this here, and these two down at the bottom. These are the libraries. If you have a look at these projects, you'll see that there's nothing in here but a library. And these are relatively simple projects that only contain a library. And these are most importantly excluded from the DTLK indexing. So when I start up, my project then opens very quickly. You notice that this opened up very fast. In fact, I could immediately use it. If I actually repeat that again, I'm seriously running out of time. If I just close this project off, and this is my project progress window down at the bottom. Normally, if we opened a project that referred to 600,000 lines of code, we'd be here for quite some time. But you can see effectively the indexing process is open and closed. So this splitting things up into sub-projects where the majority of our code that we never actually deal with is in a separate project is actually a really big advantage. It could be that you effectively have your Zend framework code remote, and then you're working locally with just your custom code. But if you have everything local and everything split up, as you see here, that's going to be a major advantage to you when starting Studio. That's in fact the biggest advantage that you're going to see. There are some things that we're going to be looking at next week, or not next week, but in 2 weeks, that we can also do to increase performance. So we can effectively adjust our build path and our include path appropriately. That will be effectively showing you the details of what I just hinted at just now. We can, of course, alter filtering, validation, semantic analysis. We can alter the way that memory is used. And, of course, we can adjust indexing. What it's saying here with corrupt index database is that if you've got a huge project, and the indexing takes forever, then a lot of people just get annoyed with Studio and kill it. And if you do that often enough, there's a likelihood that you're going to corrupt the index database, and then you get into all sorts of trouble. So we'll be looking at how to resolve that problem as well next time. So very quickly, anybody got any questions about what we discussed today, or is that all clear?
Well, from what I could see, anything should be clear because I didn't see any questions either.
Yeah. Well, that's quite a nice thing. So obviously, I wasn't talking over anybody's heads. That's a good thing. So you've already seen 1 or 2 tips that you can effectively apply to your projects. So I suggest you go and do that. And we'll meet each other again in 2 weeks' time and continue with some of the details. I'll hand you back to Lydia at this point.
Actually, I just saw a question, so don't go away.
No, wow. Okay, the question is from Alexander. How can we include a remote server to already created project? That's what I tried to do, Alexander, but it unfortunately didn't work out for me. What you'd normally, wrong window. What you normally want to do is, and the problem is that my project doesn't match to my remote project. But let's take this as an example. We've got this project and it's open. We right-click and get the context menu for this project. Click on Properties, and then we can go to Remote Server Support. And at this point, we can enable Remote Server Support, select one of our pre-existing remote servers, or we can create a new one by adding a new server into our list, and that could be either via SSH or FTP. Then once we have that selected, we have to apply our path mapping so that our project lines up with the remote project correctly. We specify if we want to manually upload files or if we want to have them uploaded on save, or just whenever we actually execute the program in our browser. And effectively, that's all you need to do. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I've got another question. Why are you doing remote server connections? How does one not do this with SVN? Some people don't have version control, in which case they tend to work usually in a very simple manner on the remote server itself. It could be that effectively your you're making subtle changes to a deployed system, it's not a good idea, but it's sometimes done. But yes, normally a version control system is the way to go, but not a lot of people, not everybody works that way. So of course, version control, best case. This is the second best. I suppose you could say this is the poor man's version control. It's effectively more than one person can work on the same remote server, and it is possible to also merge changes when you're uploading. But of course, SVN is definitely the best way to work.
So one other question I could see is, would it be better to use Linux or Windows for using Zend Studio?
Lots of people say that the Linux version of Zend Studio is not as good. It must be said that I've worked with both. I do tend to only work with the Linux version on virtual machines, so the performance is hard for me to gauge. But both are, of course, equally as capable products. I guess it really depends on the policies of your company. Some companies tend to insist on having Windows workstations, in which case it's always best to work with the Windows version of Studio so that you can effectively work locally, because that is the biggest factor affecting performance. If, however, you've got an open hand on the operating system that you can use, then effectively you're not going to see a huge difference, like I say, so long as you're working locally. But definitely we're going to be back in 2 weeks' time, so if you've got any questions in the interim period, then just save them up and we'll cover them next time. And just the last note, that's my email address for supplementary questions should anybody have them.